Hello, my name is Grace Klopp, and my presentation explores ancient Chinese poetry, primarily from the Tang Dynasty and its influence on Chinese education. The Tang Dynasty, which ruled from roughly 618 to 901 AD, was a golden era for poetry. Here you'll see pictures of two famous Tang poets, Luo Binwang and Li Bai. To this day, Chinese education emphasizes the importance of memorizing poems from both of these poets and many others, and their words are deeply ingrained into the memories of nearly all Chinese citizens. For instance, an Ode to the Goose by a 7-year-old Luo Binwang is often the first poem taught to Chinese children due to its simplicity. Thoughts on a Silent Night by Li Bai is another poem most Chinese people know by heart and expresses loneliness, nostalgia, and homesickness. My final paper of this project will explore the methods by which Chinese school teachers teach ancient poetry. It will also explore how archaic language found within Tang poetry assists students in their studies in ways that Westerners wouldn't expect. Finally, I will suggest that Chinese teachers and professors in foreign countries ought to implement a stronger Tang poetry curriculum, because understanding the poetry taught in Chinese primary schools is crucial for becoming fluent in Mandarin Chinese. Chinese poetry has great cultural significance and has been passed down from generation to generation. Every child is expected to memorize famous poems, but much of the poetry's archaic language makes little sense to these Chinese learners. Yet, teachers claim that the poems help students learn how Chinese characters interact with one another, and are also a great way to practice tone combinations. Learning Chinese poetry is a lens into Chinese culture and an excellent source for practicing memorization and speech. Furthermore, as Chinese students grow older, they are expected to memorize many forms of classical Chinese, often to perform well on the National College Entrance Examination. Enforcers of Chinese education view classical Chinese as an upgraded version of modern Chinese, in which students can directly comprehend what an author says from thousands of years ago. Students will also be able to understand and express complex meaning using extremely simple words, like quotes and idioms. Ultimately, I think that Chinese poetry is taught in schools to enhance Chinese speaking, writing, and reading ability, educate students in Chinese history, and ground students with a sense of national pride in their country's rich culture. Since I am merely an American student who studies Chinese, I am currently asking several Chinese students and professors on the William & Mary campus about their experience with Tang poetry in education. I set out a questionnaire to Chinese-speaking students and professors and plan to collect responses from them in Chinese organizations on campus. Several of the survey's questions I have listed on the slides. So far, every person to complete the survey has confirmed they learned classical Chinese poetry in both primary and secondary schools, and that they thought such education was necessary. All surveyed believed that studying and memorizing classical Chinese poetry in schools enhanced their ability to speak, write, and read Chinese. The majority believed that learning poems improved their knowledge of Chinese history and gave them a sense of national pride in China's rich culture, although a minority said it had no effect on those things. All surveyed enjoyed learning Chinese poetry and believed that it endowed them with a sense of wisdom. Recounting personal experience from when I took Chinese 101 as a freshman in William & Mary, I remember our professor quickly going over Jin Ye Si by Li Bai and Deng GuangQue Lou by Wang Zhihuan. While we weren't expected to memorize or even be tested on these poems, I basically found myself struck by ancient wisdom. I began incorporating Tang poetry quotes in my essays, which significantly boosted my grades. When I competed in a Chinese speech competition for beginners, my professor instructed me to use the phrase 飞流之下三千尺 to describe my saliva when tasting Beijing duck for the first time. I thought this was weird, and I didn't know that the Li Bai quote translated as flows downward 3,000 feet, and actually describes a waterfall within the mountains. Upon saying this phrase at the competition, the entire crowd of Chinese viewers burst into joyous laughter, and I scored very high in the Chinese-speaking category. My incorporation of Chinese poetry has boosted my grades on occasion and allowed me to connect to Chinese speakers in a deeper way. Admittedly, digressing slightly from primary schools, Chinese poetry influences all areas of Chinese life. Tang poetry still has a strong grasp on today's forms of entertainment. For instance, the hard rock band Tang Dynasty, or Tang Chao, is one of many bands influenced by Tang works. Tang Chao is a heavy metal band with lyrical poetry and musical arrangements meant to harken back to the glorious days of ancient Chinese civilization. The Chinese Poetry Congress is an ongoing game show on China's Central Television that tests competitors' memory in recitation of Chinese poetry. Even current Chinese leader Xi Jinping and other party officials include poetry in official speeches. Undoubtedly, classical Chinese poetry has massive influence over Chinese culture and language. Perhaps teachers educating foreign students should emphasize the importance of learning classical Chinese poetry in order to make their Chinese speaking abilities more well-rounded and authentic. The end.